All right, so getting started for today, talking about the tree of life. We got lots of interesting stuff to talk about. Okay, so the place where we left off the last time was with the evolutionary tree, where you look at the way that the different species and different basically the kingdoms have spun off at different points and at which place they are similar, and then the branches, how they are splitting and becoming different. So one of the things about an evolutionary tree is that it doesn't show where the groups are primitive or advanced. We tend to think, okay, fish over here, very primitive, human all the way over here, very advanced. That's not how you actually read an evolutionary tree. Just means that all of these things right here are alive at the same time, and that they've come from a common ancestor and at what point they split off. So these wouldn't be one over another in terms of being very advanced. As you guys know from when we talked about genetics, that we have onions that have way more chromosomes than we'll ever have. That doesn't make an onion more advanced than a human. Or goldfish have a very small number. That doesn't mean a goldfish is less advanced than a human. It just shows at what point they had this common ancestor and at what point the DNA went in basically two different directions. It also shows what is very closely related to one another. So if you're looking at this tree, the things that are the least closely related are going to be the fish and the human. We are not very closely related to fish. We are more closely related to the ancestors of the other mammals up there, the mice and the rats. And so if we're going to look at it like this, I think we did go through this picture the last time where we look at the common ancestors and we have the branches, which we basically call speciation events. So our ancestors, at what point did we have this common ancestor? And so it still shows birds and humans pretty far apart, fish even further apart. Wow, that's also hard to read. Are humans, but I'm not going to do what I did the last time. That was too hard to do. Are humans more advanced evolutionarily than cockroaches? Means that no, we are alive at the same time, but we have a common ancestor that would have been back very, very far. And so the bacteria that are alive today are not considered lower organisms because they are alive today also, but they would have been further apart on the branches of the evolutionary tree. So this is something that you often see, and I believe it's inside of the cover of your book, that shows each one of the kingdoms. We've got our bacteria that would have had the furthest possible ancestor, common ancestor to all life on Earth. Then we have our archaeobacteria, and those are the types of bacteria that can live in very hostile territories. Like they can live in very salty bogs, they can live in the hot springs, the geysers with the boiling water. They can live in very, very hostile environments. Then we have our protists, which are some are single-celled, some are multicelled. Plants are multicellular, fungi multicellular, and then we have animals. One of the interesting things about this evolutionary tree is that usually when people think of fungus, like a mushroom or a mold, they tend to think of them as being very close to plants. Fungi are actually closer to animals than they are to plants. And so you could actually say that we have more of a common ancestor with fungi than we do with plants. Plants would have branched off much earlier at that point. And so this is what the evolutionary tree looks like. And if you were able to look all in here, you could see the different kingdoms, and then the phylums, orders, class, genus, species, as we move out of the ring of life. So the evolutionary tree has a branch for each of the millions of species that we have out there. So it would be incredibly complex, but it all works together. And so what we call these are monophyletic groups. So a monophyletic group is a group in which all the individuals are more closely related to each other than to individuals outside of that group. So all animals are going to be more closely related to animals than they would be related to plants or to fungi. All fungi within that group are going to be more closely related to other fungi than they would be to any plants or any animals. So that should pretty much make sense to you. Animals are more closely related to animals. Plants, more closely related to plants. Bacteria, more closely related to bacteria. And so this is determined by looking at these nodes of the evolutionary trees. So where we're looking at the evolutionary tree, you can see a monophyletic group is a group in which all of the individuals are more closely related to each other than to individuals outside of the group. So this one is a really cool evolutionary tree, because here, if you look at birds and crocodiles, if you were to trace back millions of years, you could actually find a common ancestor for crocodiles and birds before you could find a common ancestor between birds and lizards or crocodiles and lizards. So they compose a monophyletic group. They share a single common ancestor that is the descendant of all of the individuals within that group. So if you look here at crocodiles and lizards, they do not make up a monophyletic group because they do share a common ancestor, but the descendants of that ancestor are in another group, the birds. And so lizards, crocodiles, and birds all taken together, if you look at all three of them, they make up a group, but these two are going to make up one group. And then if we were to put all three of those together, they would make up one group. If we were to put all of these together, they would make up animals, which are another group. But we're talking about how closely related the descendants or the ancestors were of these different categories of animals, plants, fungi, protists, bacteria, all that good stuff. So in constructing these evolutionary trees, what it basically requires is us comparing similarities and differences between organisms. So if you think back to the times before we had microscopes, if you think back to the times before we were able to look at the DNA of organisms, think back to the time of Aristotle and Socrates and those people that were trying to put things into groups. The way that things would have been put into groups would be animals, anything that's moving, but as we know, there are some animals that don't move. They would have put all plants into one group. It used to be that fungi were lumped into those groups as well, because they just differentiated them based on their characteristics that they could observe from the outside. Since the 1980s, when we've been able to really study the DNA of organisms and be able to do basically DNA fingerprinting on all of these organisms, we found out some amazing relationships between organisms that we didn't know that existed before. Because if you think back to this slide that I showed you before, who wouldn't think that crocodiles and lizards weren't more closely related? Who would think that a crocodile is more closely related to a bird than it would be related to a lizard? You just wouldn't think those things. But when we trace the DNA, we can actually see that the common ancestor for birds and crocodiles was closer than to that of lizards. So here's some other interesting ones. So if you're going to look at comparative anatomy, so comparative anatomy is looking at, comparing the anatomy, which is the characteristics or the structures, and seeing how closely related they are. So an African lion and a spotted hyena, are they closely related to one another? Do they have retractable claws? So any of you guys that have cats know that cats have retractable claws because they're walking along all nice and then all of a sudden they're ripping you apart. So they have retractable claws. These guys, a black bear and a gray wolf, no retractable claws. So anybody who has cats versus dogs, you know that. If you look at the number of chambers in the ear bone, African lion, spotted hyena have 2. Black bear and gray wolf have 1. Now this was something, when I was reading this today, I was like, penis has a bone? If you Google that, it's actually quite interesting. I actually learned something today. These guys do not have a bone in their penis, the black bear and a gray wolf have an actual bone. So there's a whole article out there about bare bone penises. It's quite fantastic. You should actually read that. You'll learn some things you didn't know before. So looking at the way that they are related to one another, you wouldn't think that a hyena would be more closely related to an African lion than to a wolf, because hyenas and wolves seem to be dog-like. But when you look at their comparative anatomy, they're actually very far apart. So a hyena and a lion are more closely related when you compare their anatomy. And a black bear and a gray wolf are more closely related if you look at their anatomy. So lots of fascinating ways to group things into categories. So this is just looking at the outside. Once we look in the inside, looking at the DNA, we get a whole different story. So when we look at DNA-based evolutionary trees, what we basically do is we match up the pairs of DNA bases. And we compare how similar the DNA sequences are between the two groups. So like if this one is the lion and this one is the hyena, you see that they have all of these in common, but they might have this set of base pairs and this set of base pairs being different. And then if we look at species 3 being the black bear and species 4 being the gray wolf, these guys may have all of these in common, but then you get to this set and they have a different set of base pairs. They have all these in common, different set of base pairs. All these in common. So then, if we look at the differences between species 2 and species 3, we can see all of these base pairs are different. So these guys have more in common with one another, and these guys have more in common with one another, but they're pretty far apart evolutionarily, so that's how we know that the common ancestor is pretty far in the past. So the more similarities that they have in their DNA sequences, the more closely related the two species are. So species 1 and 2 are similar, species 3 and 4 are similar, but then when you go back even further, millions and millions of years, you get to that common ancestor pretty far in the past. So similar structures don't always reveal common ancestry. So the picture that goes along with this is, if you think of a mammal, like a bat, it flies. And you think of a insect, like a butterfly, it flies. So you think, did they have a common ancestor at one point that had wings, and bats and insects came from a common ancestor? And the answer to this is no, that they have a common ancestor that would be back very far in the past, but they would have developed wings equally and independently, so they evolved independently to have wings. Because having wings is a pretty cool adaptation for making things able to survive. If you think about insects, if you remember back to us talking about the insects had those little nubs of wings, and they would use the little nubs to flap them and cool themselves down in the tropical paradise. And as they got a little bit more wings, they would be able to cool themselves a little bit better. So eventually one day they're flapping their wings and cooling themselves off, and they realize that they can glide, or eventually that they can fly. Similar thing would have happened with these mammals. So mammals at one point, very separate from insects, may have had the skin between their limbs that started to get a little bit longer, and it jumps out of a tree. The ones that have a little more skin there are able to glide. The ones that jump out of the tree with nothing there, it reminds me of like Saturday morning cartoons, like you jump out of the tree and plunk, you're on the ground. So would have developed independently of one another and not for the same reason. So even though they have similar structures, they didn't come from the same place. So they may have shared a wingless ancestor really far in the past, but they developed wings independently of one another. So we can map species characteristics onto these phylogenetic trees. So before the 1980s, we simply looked at physical features. We put things onto these trees based on their characteristics that we could observe from the outside. And then in 1980, when we became able to do these DNA fingerprints, or this DNA sequencing, then it became easier to know what was actually related to one another as far as DNA went. So here are three species. We have our common shrew, our African golden mole, and our African elephant. It used to be, pre-1980s, that people thought the shrew and the mole would be very closely related to one another because they look similar. If you look at them, they're both little kind of rat-like creatures that burrow around. And so even though those two resemble one another, the African golden mole and the African elephant actually share a common ancestor much later in development than the common shrew. And so they grew up on the same continent, common shrew here in North America, African mole, African elephant in Africa. So it's actually been shown that the mole and the African elephant share a much more common ancestor than either of them do to the common shrew. And so when I went to South Africa, I actually saw an animal that was like the golden mole, and it's about the size of a football. It looks like a football, and it's actually like the next closest related descendant to the African elephant. So it's amazing to look at this little football-sized creature and think the other closely related organism is the African elephant. I don't remember exactly what the name of it was, but I can look it up. So this is an example of what we call convergent evolution. So this is when populations of organisms live in similar environments, and so they experience similar selective forces. So the two African animals would have grown up on Africa together and would have evolved from a much closer common ancestor. So they have what is called an analogous trait. An analogous trait is a characteristic like the bat wings or the insect wings that is the same because they were produced by convergent evolution and they do not descend from a common structure in an ancestor they shared. So think about where you would find a shrew. A shrew would be burrowing around in the dirt and would be eating insects. The African golden mole, same thing, burrowing around in the dirt, eating insects. So even though they shared a common ancestor a really, really, really long time ago, these two are living in similar environments. They're eating similar things. They've developed what are called analogous traits. They are similar to one another because they're in the same environment. These two have very different traits because the African elephant is going to live in a much different environment. You can't even picture an African elephant if he was trying to keep up with a golden mole burrowing around in the ground. So the African golden mole resembles a shrew, but its DNA sequences show that it is more closely related to the African elephant. So it's something that we've uncovered once we've learned more about DNA that we never would have thought of in the past. And so then comes the big question, how do you know whether a trait is homologous or analogous? So the way that we find that out is through DNA analysis. If we find traits that are analogous traits or features that are produced by the convergent evolution, then that means that they are living in the same type of environment. If they are homologous traits, then those are features that are inherited from a common ancestor. So homologous, same structure from a common ancestor, like if you think of the arm bones in a human, the arm bones in a horse, the arm bones in a bat, the arm bones in a dolphin. They all have similar bone structures, but they use it to do different things. So we would have got it from a common ancestor. And then analogous traits produced by convergent evolution, so not closely related, but doing similar types of things, like the shrew and the mole are burrowing around through the dirt. So then comes the question that I think a lot of people get tripped up on when it comes to evolution, because talking about macroevolution, how did we go from these common ancestors to things that are so wildly different. How did we go from living in the oceans or single-celled bacteria to these great and wonderful and beautiful creatures that we see all around the Earth? And the next thing that we talk about is macroevolution. So macroevolution is something above the species level. So if we're talking about the difference between a fish and an amphibian, that would be macroevolution. How do we go from completely different organisms and trace those back to these common ancestors? How do we have the difference between an amphibian and a lizard, or a lizard and a bird, or a bird and a mammal, or a mammal and, we are mammals, a human? So there's no additional process that's necessary here. It's not like we have a fish turning into an amphibian. It's not like we have an amphibian turning into a lizard. What we find is that all of these little microscopic changes that happen at the DNA level, when happening over millions of years, we have time for these organisms to become wildly different. If we look here at the Grand Canyon didn't happen in a day. It didn't happen in a year. It didn't happen in 10,000 years. It took a river running for millions of years to carve out that much rock to actually get this very dramatic and huge difference in the landscape. And so same thing happened with plants and animals and protists and bacteria. These little microscopic changes, just like a river carrying away little bits of sand at a time, over the course of millions and millions of years, we end up with these wildly different and huge differences between organisms and in our environment. So if we talk about short-term differences, the little DNA changes that happen very quickly, or mutations, or long-term results, microevolution being the changes in the DNA, and then macroevolution being the huge differences that we have between different genuses and different orders and different phylum. If you look at micro versus macro, evolution is only one thing, a change in allele frequencies in a population. So we can see that little tiny changes happen in populations because mutations happen, the way that the DNA comes together is different because whether you got the sperm or the egg and who you got it from, and then mitosis and meiosis. So those little tiny changes over a long period of time can lead to a new species. And then eventually, over a longer period of time, we have groups of species that vary tremendously from one another. And because environments around the world are so very different, and they're dealing with different pressures of trying to survive in these harsh environments, microevolution over periods of millions of years can go from one little slight change over long periods of time morph into very distinct and different species. And so that's how we got all of these various species that we have all over the Earth. Nothing changed like a bird changing into a lizard, or lizard changing into an amphibian, or amphibian changing into lizard. Nothing huge happened like that. It was all little tiny changes one by one. And so the pace of evolution is not constant. It's not like every generation we have these huge changes. Sometimes we see that if the mutation is large enough, but for the most part there is no step-by-step process. Sometimes mutations take place and nothing appears to change in the organism, so populations are steady and stable for long periods of time. But sometimes we have these huge, and they're called punctuated equilibrium, where this huge change happens all at once, and that huge change causes something to be able to survive, or this huge change happens and everything dies off. And so we've seen gradual changes. If you think about what you know about butterflies, butterflies can very gradually change due to mutations, and this is where we have evolution by creeps. So little incremental steps of one species changing and mutating and adapting to its environment. And then we have what's called punctuated equilibrium. This is evolution by jerks. It's funny, creeps and jerks, it makes you think of like bad guys. Evolution by these huge jerky processes where we have rapid evolutionary change. This is often accompanying things like major environmental changes like ice ages or earthquakes or new waterways being built or shifts in tectonic plates. So things are forced to either adapt to these wild environmental changes or they're going to die off. And so even though we might have rapid evolutionary change, this may only cover 1% of a species' evolutionary history, but it may cover hundreds or thousands of generations. So this could take thousands of years in a primate, or in bacteria, it might take a matter of months. As you guys looked at with the bacteria in our antibiotic resistance lab, as we go from using antibiotics to kill off bacteria, our bacteria are changing. They're either going to adapt or they're going to die. So we either kill them off or they're going to adapt to our antibiotics. If we don't come up with something new, then they could be the ones that win the evolutionary arms race. So we have gradual changes, and sometimes we have giant changes. So adaptive radiations are times of extreme diversification. So this is when we have a very small number of species that is diversifying into a much larger number of species. And so this may happen along with three types of events. If we have a mass extinction event, like the one that killed off the dinosaurs, where we have a giant meteorite that is coming down and causing catastrophic damage to the Earth, and we have competition that's suddenly eliminated because lots of things die off in a mass extinction, then the species that are left behind that are able to survive this mass speciation or mass extinction can very rapidly spread out into new territory and rapidly become different species. We also have what are called colonization events, like the first organisms to reach Hawaii after the volcanoes erupt, and we have fresh, brand new Earth for them to go and colonize these islands. Or the Galapagos Islands, the first time that they reach that new location, whether by air, by sea, or in the case of humans, we're taking all kinds of invasive species around the Earth. So when things move to a new location and have new resources and possibly fewer competitors, then colonizers can rapidly diversify. So like if you're a ship coming over from England and you've got barnacles stuck to your hull, and you're the first ship that goes through the waterway passages into Lake Erie and then deposits those barnacles. If nothing eats them and nothing kills them and they find resources to be able to survive, then boom, you've got an invasive species that you can't get rid of, which is something that's happening in Lake Erie right now. There's all kinds of colonization events that we see happening, which is essentially what just happened with Ebola, where Ebola came over from a country that it normally wouldn't leave that little village, but as people can get on planes, get on trains, drive away in their cars, go away in boats, they can bring these strange and exotic diseases to places where we don't know how to get rid of them. And so the final way is evolutionary innovations. So like the insect, that it goes from the wing nubs that help it to be able to dissipate the heat, and then the bigger the wings get, the better it can get rid of the heat, until eventually the wings fly, which allows them to rapidly diversify. So you can see these all take place with these wild events that are happening here on Earth all the time, and have been happening ever since there was an Earth. So three phenomenon. Oh, so I guess I just talked about those without going through all the slides. Colonizers, Galapagos, Hawaiian fruit flies, the wings and the rigid skeleton, the exoskeleton. So as you know, insects don't have an internal skeleton. They have an exoskeleton that helps to protect them from losing water, from the heat, from the elements, and it helped them to diversify into the most successful group of animals. So there's more than 800,000 and probably more than 1 million out there, species of insects, and they're on every continent. They survive everywhere because insects are so good at rapidly changing and having these mutated genes that they're all different and they're all pretty fascinating. So if you think back to everything that you know about the dinosaurs from grade school, this is where I wish my kid was here because he'd tell you all about this. So there have been several mass extinctions on Earth. There have actually been 5 major mass extinctions where at that time 99.9% of all living things died off in those 5 mass extinctions. So only 0.1% of the species that are out there were able to actually survive these mass extinctions. So these mass extinctions, here's the last time we had dinosaurs, about 65 million years ago. This is when the meteorite hit the Yucatan Peninsula, where Mexico is, in the Gulf of Mexico. That giant meteorite comes down. It sends all this debris up into the atmosphere, kills off a lot of the plants, and a lot of things starve and freeze. And so dinosaur extinction happened at this point. We see things going extinct all of the time. Here we have 255 million years ago. This was the Great Dying. This is where more living things were killed off on Earth than anything else. I'm not sure exactly what the event is that goes along with that. I know this one is with the asteroid. I'm not sure exactly which this one is. But we have these 5 events. And what is so interesting is that we are seeing another mass extinction happening right now because of humans. Humans are actually causing more species to go extinct now than we have seen at any other time on the planet. And so here you can see that some things are naturally going extinct. Things are always becoming extinct because the Earth is always changing. Resources are always changing. Adaptations are always being made. Things are always going to be predators killing off the prey, and then the predators die when there's no more prey, like you saw in the lab with natural selection and the forks and the spoons and the sporks and all of that good stuff. So in mass extinctions, a large number of species become extinct over a short period of time. In background extinctions, things are always becoming extinct, but at lower amounts than this period that happened of the Great Dying. So background extinctions occur at lower rates during periods other than the periods of these mass extinctions, and these occur mainly as the result of natural selection. So not being able to survive in the sun, or not having enough food to eat, or not having enough resources, not having a big enough territory. If you think about what humans are doing now to the territory of a lot of species out there, if you think about like pandas and lions and tigers, we're destroying their habitat, and so when habitats go away, it's hard for things to survive. So, background extinctions and mass extinctions are going to have different causes. So things naturally becoming extinct because of natural selection, but then these mass extinctions event are due to extraordinary or sudden changes, like the asteroid hitting the Earth. So is it happening naturally, or is it happening because of one giant sudden change to the environment? So this is the last time we would have seen a global climate change where we had this worldwide mass extinction. This is one of the reasons scientists are so worried about the climate changing right now. Because if the climate changes enough, maybe not in 10 years, maybe not in 100 years, but if the Earth changes by so much as 2 degrees, we may be covered over by the polar ice caps melting. We may see a catastrophic event where we lose our food supply. And if humans can't eat, then humans can't live. And so we may see a mass extinction happen due to our own doing. So these catastrophic events that happen, we can study what they've done in the past, so we know what can happen in the future. And this is one of those red flags that scientists send up about these awful things happening. It's also another reason why they monitor space so closely, because if an asteroid is headed our way, we want to know about it before before it happens. Or maybe you wouldn't want to know. What was the movie where the asteroid was coming to Earth and Liv Tyler and Bruce Willis? There you go. Armageddon, basically. So looking at an overview of the diversity of life on Earth, the amount and different number of species that are out there are amazing, but we can actually put them into 3 groups. So all living organisms divided into one of these 3 groups through a classification system. It used to be we thought there were 2 kingdoms of animals and plants. We put everything into those kingdoms. You're either an animal or you're a plant. Now, and this has even happened since I started studying biology. I remember back to the 3 kingdom system, or it was 4 kingdoms, when I studied biology in 1996. So I still have a textbook that shows the 4 kingdom classification system where it was just plants, animals, fungi, and protists. We didn't have Monera. And so as we've learned more about these different categories and classification, we've taken this huge step forward where Carl Weiss, who is an American biologist, examined the DNA of lots of different organisms and tracked the changes in them over time. So the original 3 domains of life were bacteria, which there's more bacteria out there than you can even imagine. It's something like in a thimbleful. How many of you know what a thimble is? How many of you have used a thimble? I can't even think of the last time I saw a thimble. A thimbleful of soil is going to have 1 million bacteria in it. So if you think about how many thimbles full of soil we have all around the Earth, we have, I don't know how many millions and billions and trillions of bacteria that we have. Then we have our archaeobacteria, which are the bacteria that can survive in hostile environments. And then we have eukarya, which are the protist, plants, fungi, and animals. So bacteria and archaeobacteria are prokaryotes, and then all of these guys are our eukaryotes. You can trace them back to billions of years ago of that common ancestor of all life on Earth. So Weiss's approach was not perfect because he wanted to include viruses in here. Viruses are not included in this tree of life because viruses are not capable of going through their own metabolism. So viruses latch onto a host's metabolism in order to replicate. And so that is really one of the big controversies in science. What do we do about these viruses that act like living creatures but that don't actually go through their own metabolism? So after our ancestral bacterium that was 3.4 billion years ago, the most commonly accepted tree of life is that we have our bacteria that are alive currently. We have archaeobacteria, most of which are extinct, but some of which are not. And then, so we have this split right here between bacteria and archaeobacteria. Then we have another split where we have the membrane-bound organelles. And so we've got our protists, and then along comes our branch of plants. Along comes the branch of fungi, and then along comes the current animal cells that we are all so fond of having. So the bacterial domain has a tremendous amount of biological diversity. Like I said, if you went out and looked in any amount of soil anywhere in the earth, you would find these bacteria. And so you even find these bacteria inside of your mouth. There are hundreds of species of bacteria living in your mouth right now. And they're competing for resources on your tongue and in your teeth. And they are multiplying and dividing. So the next time that you wake up with stinky, smelly breath, it is basically... So if that's not delightful, yeah. So here's a tooth with bacteria all over it. Bacteria have a biomass greater than all of the plants and animals on Earth. So if we took all the plants and animals on Earth and stuck them on a scale, there would still be more bacteria out there than anything else. They live in Arctic ice. They live in volcanoes. They live inside of you, in your intestines, in your mouth, in your bloodstream. Bacteria are everywhere. And they make up one of these monophyletic groups. So they have common features. They're single cells, no nucleus, no organelles. They don't have mitochondria. They don't have a Golgi apparatus. They don't have a endoplasmic reticulum. They have no nucleus, just that circle of DNA inside, circular DNA. They have several methods of exchanging genetic information. They can exchange it by pili, where they attach to one another. They can split apart through asexual reproduction. And so they live in all kinds of wild places, and they reproduce in all kinds of wild ways. And so this, that domain includes archaea, which have many species that live in these extreme environments. Like if you go to the, I believe this is one of the Great Salt Lakes that has Old Faithful in it, Yellowstone National Park. So in the geyser, there are bacteria that can live and thrive at boiling temperatures. And so how does something live and survive in such a wild and inhospitable environment? So they have tremendous diversity, and they're divided into 5 different groups. So something that is a thermophile, thermo meaning heat, phile meaning loving, so love to live in hot places, is a thermophile. Something that is a halophile lives in a salty place. So halo is salt, phile, love, so halophile loves to live in salty places. They can live at very high and very low pHs, so they can live in basic and acidic environments. They can live under tremendous pressure. They've found bacteria that are alive 2.5 miles underneath the crust of the earth. If you go down in the ocean all the way to the bottom of the trenches, think about how much pressure it is with all that water pushing down on top of you. The bacteria live down there. And then we have methanogens, which live in methane, and methane is a toxic gas. And so we have these archaeobacteria that can live in places that nothing else can live in. And so the eukarya is going to consist of all the other stuff. So we've got bacteria, which live everywhere, archaeobacteria, which live in hostile places, and then our plants and animals and fungi and protists, which are the eukarya. Those are the ones that have the membrane-bound organelles. So what is that? Like cherries? Tomatoes? I'm not sure exactly. Slime molds. Slime molds. There you go. So if there's a professor here on campus that actually studies those. I can't believe I didn't remember that. And then plants, and then fungi, and then our good old animals. So, oh, yep, we're done with that. And I will tomorrow have to you a study guide for the test, which is next Thursday. And so we're going to be 7, 8, 9, and 10. I'm not sure exactly what we'll do in class on Tuesday, but it might be a review session. So I think 7, 8, 9, and 10, that's a lot. If you haven't started reading, now is the time. And yeah, I'll put together a review session. But I'll get you the review sheet by tomorrow. Yay. Did anybody watch my videos with the intro in them? Ah, I was hoping. I wanted somebody to actually tell me like, oh, that's cool, or